My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler historian and also a director of the Center of Human Rights Research at the University of Manitoba. We're based at the university's Fort Garry campus, located in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, and bound by the agreements and the relations of Treaty 1 and the Manitoba Act. Our drinking water comes from Treaty 3 to the east, and our hydroelectric power from Treaty 5 to our west and our north. And it is here that we do the work of coordinating and promoting research that is concerned with human rights and Indigenous rights, both broadly defined. Since 2012, the Center for Human Rights Research has held an annual seminar series open to the public. We took this critical conversation series online early in the pandemic, and we have remained in this digital space for the time being, using the available tools to more easily welcome speakers and audiences from beyond as well as within this particular geography. This year's Critical Conversation series is focused on our new research theme, and that is borders and human rights. With this theme, we hope to make more and closer connection with researchers, engaging both the connections and the disconnections between borders and human rights. Our understanding of borders is layered and is in conversation with Indigenous histories, sovereignties, and resurgence, and with critical anti-racist scholarship, and pays attention to the way that borders are lived and challenged in gendered, embodied, and intimate ways. By borders, we mean the formal geopolitical ones, including the medicine line to our immediate south that was drawn through Cree, Anishinaabe, Métis, and Dakota territories in the 1870s, just as Canada's particular settler colonial project was taking a new form of control. But we are also thinking of the related social, cultural, and political borders between different communities within nation states, between presumed and constituted racial groups, and producing and reproducing ideas of gender, of family, and of identity. We've been planning this theme and this speaker series for some time now. That critically thinking about borders matters and matters in new ways was made clear by the events of the last 10 days or so, beginning with the announcement that Canada had agreed to extend the Safe Third Country Agreement that has been in place since 2004 with the United States, essentially extending the agreement beyond official ports of entry to the entire length of the Canada-US border. Less than 2 weeks later, the discovery of 8 dead migrants who seem to have lost their lives trying to cross the St. Lawrence River, 2 of them children, makes painfully clear the real consequences of these policy changes to people on the move. And it is no accident that these histories played out within the Mohawk territory of Akwesasne. Our goal today is to reflect on some of the ways that we might think about borders, might rethink borders, and how the work they do, whether through transnational movement, through resistance, through identity, through gender, through language, and how ongoing research and ongoing rethinking might help us understand the difficult histories that continue to unfold around borders. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, who will speak first for about 5 to 7 minutes. Then we'll have some time for conversation between the panelists, and then some time for questions, either submitted at registration or through the Zoom Q&A function, which should be at your bottom right. And I also want to thank the sign language interpreters, Brenda, Rutherford, and Tania MacNeil from Equality Communications Center of Excellence. I'll first introduce Dr. Lorena Fontaine, who is Korean Anishinaabe and a citizen of Sagin First Nation in Manitoba. She is an associate professor in human rights and coordinator of the Indigenous Languages program at the University of Winnipeg. Her research concerns Indigenous language rights, the legacy of residential schooling, and cultural genocide. She was recently awarded a Canada Fulbright Research Chair at San Diego State University to explore the repatriation of Indigenous cultural memory and language. She has co-organized educational forums with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the Dorn's Life Center for Advanced Genocide in Los Angeles. For over 2 decades, Dr. Fontaine has been an advocate for residential school survivors and their descendants. She was a task force member and contributor to the Assembly of Manitoba First Nations report on Canada's dispute resolution. She has acted as legal counsel in a class action on residential schools. In 2019, she was invited to serve as an expert witness to the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples regarding the Indigenous Languages Act. Dr. Fontaine has also served on several national committees, such as an Equity Rights Panel member for the Court Challenges Program, and a National Steering Committee member for the National Association of Women in the Law in Canada. She has been involved with Women's Legal Education Action Fund as a board member and a subcommittee member. After Dr. Fontaine, we will hear from Dr. Lori Wilkinson, who focuses on the migration and resettlement experiences of refugees, particularly children, youth, and their families. She is the Director of Immigration Research West and was recently appointed Canada Research Chair in Migration Futures. Wilkinson is currently working on a nationally funded study on the arrival experiences of Afghan refugees in Canada, a study of gender and sexually based violence experienced by refugee women, and she also heads a 3-nation study of the socioeconomic and mental health effects of the COVID-19 social and economic restrictions on immigrant and refugee families. Our third speaker is Dr. Shayna Plaut. Her work's at the intersection of academia, journalism, and advocacy, focusing on the ethics, methods, and self-representation in journalism and transnational advocacy, particularly with people who do not fit well within traditional understandings of the nation state. Her work has been published in a variety of human rights, sociology, and journalistic academic journals, and she is the lead editor for an upcoming collaborative book entitled The Messy Ethics of Human Rights Work, to be published by UBC Press. As an educator, researcher, and journalist, she has taught and designed courses on human rights, migration ethics and methods, and human rights journalism and human rights stories. Shayna is the director for the Center for Social Science Research and Policy at the University of Manitoba and the incoming director of research at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. She has served as a consultant for the UN's Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Amnesty International, and a variety of migrant and human rights organizations throughout Canada, the US, and Europe. And since 2014, she has served as research managers for Stranger at Home, a project of the Global Reporting Center. Our fourth speaker will be Rob Lorway. Rob is a professor of medical anthropology at the Institute for Global Public Health at the University of Manitoba, where he holds the Canada Research Chair for Global Intervention, Politics, and Social Transformation. His research analyzes how forms of intervention life unfurl around transnationally mediated attempts to alleviate the suffering of stigmatized people. He has written 2 books on the subject: Namibia's Rainbow Project, Gay Rights in an African Nation, and AIDS Activism, Science, and Community Across 3 Continents. Our fifth speaker is Dr. Shauna Labman. Shauna is the Executive Director of the Global College at the University of Winnipeg. She is an Associate Professor of Human Rights and a legal scholar who writes and speaks extensively on refugee law, resettlement, and private refugee sponsorship within a broader context of human rights and public international law. Her 2019 book, Crossing Law's Border, Canada's Refugee Resettlement Program, examines the intersection of international rights, responsibilities, and obligation in the absence of a legal scheme for refugee resettlement. She is the co-editor of 2020's Strangers to Neighbors, Refugee Sponsorship in Canada. She completed both her PhD and her LLM at the University of British Columbia and received her LLB from the University of Victoria. She has worked with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in New Delhi, the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, the Law Commission of Canada in Ottawa, the Workers' Compensation Board of British Columbia, and the Nunavut Court of Justice in Iqaluit. She is articled as a law clerk at Canada's Federal Court of Appeal and is currently a member of the Law Society of Manitoba and also was a member of the Law Society of Ontario for some time. So those are 5 really remarkable speakers and thinkers and folks who have so much to say about these important questions and the moment that we find ourselves at. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Fontaine.
Thank you, Adele. I'm really, really honored to be speaking with this esteemed panel. I'm also really grateful to to the University of Manitoba for inviting me here to speak to you about Indigenous issues related to border, to the border. And I wanted to place my 5 minutes in the context of the US-Canadian border as a tool of genocide that impacts Indigenous peoples across Canada and the US, but I'm going to focus on my nation, which is the Indigenous nation. And I want to talk about how the Canada-US border has not only separated my traditional territory, but it has also impacted our ability to travel across the border to practice our ceremonies and also conduct our language revitalization work. And I'm going to pull up a map here just so you don't have to stare at my face the whole time. You can, let's see. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, I think everybody can see this now. Perfect. Okay, so here is a map of my traditional territory, the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe people. And as you can see that the territorial lines crosses 4 US states and 3 provinces in Canada. So in the US, it's northern Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And up in Canada, it's Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And we've been doing a lot of work with language and cultural revitalization on both sides of the border. And one of the things that we've been working on actively is looking at some of our laws that govern our territory. And I've just pulled up here one in Ojibwe. Our term for citizenship is Dibenje Gazuin, which means someone who owns or controls their associations. And this is critical when we're looking at border issues because of our ability to have relational mobility on both sides of the border, not only to people, but also our living environment. And this border has impacted our work in the area of cultural and linguistic revitalization. And I'm going to just briefly talk about the revitalization of our cultural ceremonies in the context of ceremonies that my family and I attend. We have to travel back and forth to these ceremonies because they're hosted by different Ojibwe communities in the spring, winter, summer, and fall. And in these ceremonies, we learn about our healing ceremonies, our naming ceremonies. People get married at these ceremonies, and we also hold our funerals. Most importantly, these ceremonies are where we're able to pass on the cultural identity and the linguistic identity to our children. And as we work towards this cultural and language revitalization period in our life, our ability to connect with one another is critically important. And I'm just going to give you one example in terms of language revitalization. In the United States, there's approximately 4,000 Ojibwe speakers left. And in Canada, we have approximately 25,000 speakers. And our language revitalization work is really is a cross-border issue. In the United States, there are fewer fluent speakers, but they're more advanced with post-secondary and community programs. There, They have more active post-secondary classes that are producing speakers. In Canada, we have more speakers, but we're a little bit further behind in terms of our program development and our community program development at the post-secondary level for language revitalization. We're having a few more challenges in producing speakers, and the US has models that can offer more innovative ways to produce speakers. So we really need each other when we're looking at program development, but also our ability to share speakers cross-border. And we are challenged by these borders for not only the ability to travel, but the ability to share language teachers and the ability to conduct program development. This past year, I'll just give you one example of how many people, how many young people, and actually non-Aboriginal people, non-Indigenous people that are interested in language revitalization. I enrolled in an online class for Ojibwe language, and there were over 800 people who registered for this class, and they were Ojibwe and non-Ojibwe people. But interestingly, there were probably about 25% of non-Indigenous people that enrolled in this class. So the interest and the need for language revitalization programs is critical. And so in the US, they need assistance with our speakers. And on the Canadian side, we need methodology and the ability to work in collaboration with post-secondary institutions and also community programming. To share these resources with one another is essential for our cultural and language revitalization work. The other, so I don't want to just focus on some of the issues, but there are opportunities right now to look at how we can achieve better ability to not only cross the border, but to work on program development. So I'm just going to show you, currently in Canada, we're working on this bill, C-15, which is an act respecting the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the purpose of this legislation is to ensure that all the laws that are, or all the articles that are in the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples fall in line with Canadian law. And the Canadian government is obligated to work with Indigenous peoples on a framework that would allow for this to occur. So if we look at one of the articles in the UN Declaration that relates to the border, Article 36, it allows for Indigenous peoples in Canada to start having conversations about some of the challenges that we have currently with crossing the border, program development, language revitalization, and consult with our communities, but also with the Canadian government to look at effective measures to facilitate and exercise and ensure the implementation of our ability to cross the border. So some of the things that we've been talking about here in Canada is the ability for us to have conversations with Border Patrol so that they're aware of what our legal rights to cross the border, to be able to bring our cultural items, to be able to attend our ceremonies freely on both sides of the border. But one of the things that is kind of new in this conversation is to look at program development within community organizations to be able to have our language teachers and our knowledge keepers be able to travel across the border freely to be able to offer language classes. I'm just going to stop sharing there. So I'm going to just stop there, as I hope I didn't go over my 5 minutes.
That was great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Fontaine, I'll pass things over to Lori Wilkinson.
Sorry, I lost my mute button there. Thank you very much to the Center for Human Rights Research for organizing this panel and for inviting me, especially to Pauline and Adele for organizing this. And thank you to the audience for coming out in such great numbers. Tomorrow is April the 4th, and it's the anniversary of the 1985 Supreme Court decision on Singh versus Canada. And in this finding, the Supreme Court found that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies to refugees and refugee claimants. Specifically, the wording of the Canadian Charter, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice, actually applies to refugees and refugee claimants. And that was a big decision. And I'm glad that we're recognizing tomorrow as Refugee Rights Day in Canada. I am also thankful that the City of Toronto has declared that the month of April is Refugee Rights Month. And so it heartens me to see a municipality taking so much interest in the rights of refugees, because right now in the world that we live in, it's not so good for refugees. So in preparing for this panel, I decided not to go with slides, but I will share with you some information. Border crossers, especially those who come before they make the refugee claim, are often labeled. They're unworthy, they're untrustworthy, they're queue jumpers, they sneak in, they abuse our social welfare system, and they're disloyal to Canada, and they may even be terrorists. And so all of this jargon, it's used by politicians. You see it in the newspaper and you hear it in average discourse. So part of my job as a sociologist and a professor is to try to educate people about refugees, because I think there's a lot of people who think that, oh, it's easy to be a refugee. I'm just going to wake up one day and I'm going to move to Canada. And I know some of you online know the reality of that situation, right? It's not easy to come to Canada or anywhere else for that matter. And none of those labels are true. And yet we toss them around like they are. And we forget that even in the research world, when we talk about numbers, and I'm going to talk about some numbers because that's what I do, but in the research world and in the media and the political world, we dehumanize people when we talk about them as just being numbers. And so I want us to remember that, you know, this past week, the 4 members of the Chodhari family and 4 members of the Ayadosh family in Akwesasne drowned moving from Canada to the US because they had to. Or remembering Frisnell Richard, originally from Haiti. He died in January crossing the Roxham Road from Canada to the US. And these are journeys that people don't undertake lightly. They take it because they're human and because they're forced to. Dr. Labman will speak more authoritatively about the Safe Third Country Agreement, but they died because of the Safe Third Country Agreement. They died because people didn't care. They died because the governments cared not to name them. And so part of my other job is to humanize refugees because they are people. And I think political discourse these days that focuses on refugees as being a threat to our society, whether economically or politically or security-wise, are wrong. But I also think that discourses that try to sell refugee and migration in general as economic cash cows, or that they're somehow going to fix our demography, are also incorrect too, because these are also dehumanizing discourses. But I would be remiss if I didn't remind you about the number of people that we're talking about here. So before my 7 minutes are up, I want to mention that 89 million people worldwide are forcibly displaced. And Dr. Labman will also talk about, I'm sure, how Canada is not fulfilling its fair share of protecting refugees because we take so very few people. So although we're expecting 76,000 refugees in the next year, out of 89 million, that's not very many. And in fact, 83% of refugees are hosted by low and middle income countries that can't even afford to protect them. And, Canada really, it spends so much time patting itself on the back that we're doing such a good job that we forget our real lack of initiative here. And just to remind us, there were 557 recorded deaths on the US-Mexico border in 2021. That increased to 748 in the first 11 months of 2022. So people are dying crossing the southern border in North America. People die in North America trying to get smuggled into the country in the backs of unventilated transport trailers. Most of us on the call probably know about the 25,716 people who died in the last 8 years trying to cross the Mediterranean Ocean. But probably not many of us realize that another 321 people died trying to cross into North America from the Caribbean. The Darien Gap, which is located in Panama, there's no road there. It's 106 kilometers of no road. 39 people died just in one accident in February alone. They estimate that 250,000 people walked across the Darien Gap in 2022 just to get to North America. So there's a lot of people in need, which brings me to my research on Afghanistan. So currently I'm doing a study of the resettlement experiences of Afghan refugees to Canada. And so it's my job to understand how Canada accepts and resettles and integrates people, because the other side of the equation is if we're going to step up to bring people to Canada, we need to make them feel like they're part of Canada, because they will be part of Canada. I will close by saying that really I've devoted my research work to activism, by activism, I mean mostly from an educative perspective, trying to educate ordinary Canadians, educate students, educate others who are around me about refugees and what role that they play in our lives, and how Canada can better accommodate and integrate them. And I think that's the best kind of activism that I can possibly do. But I know that there are other ways that we can do activism as well, and I'm happy to talk about them during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Dr. Wilkinson, we'll pass things over to Shayna Plaut.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the 71 people who are currently attending. Thank you very much also for the ASL interpretation. I am not known for speaking slowly. If I start speaking in my normal pace, please cyber kick me. And thank you also to Pauline and to Adele and to my co-panelists. My name is Shayna Plaut. I join you here from my home office in Treaty 1 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. My name, if you translate it, means beautiful refugee. And so when people ask me why I work on issues regarding human rights and people who don't fit in well with the traditional understanding of the nation state, I do what every good Jewish person does, and I blame my mother. and say she named me beautiful refugee, she didn't name me quiet accountant. Here we go. My research, my academic research really speaks to issues that both Dr. Fontaine and Dr. Wilkinson brought up, which is that I look at how people represent themselves in their own media and in their own advocacy. People who are transnational peoples. And I will explain in a second what I mean in terms of transnational peoples, for one. But Pauline, actually, if you can help, because for some reason it's coming up in that funny way. But people who are transnational peoples, and who have who are one nation who spans between, within, and across states. So what I mean by that is it could be people who are indigenous. For instance, Anishinaabe people, as Dr. Fontaine was speaking in terms of her own peoples. It could be people who are not indigenous. For instance, Berbers or Kurds. But it's one nation crossing over multiple states, and so they have an uncomfortable relationship with the border, and states tend to have a very uncomfortable relationship with them, because it comes down to this notion of suspicion, of threat, of who are you actually loyal to. Next slide, please. Are you loyal to your nation? Are you loyal to your quote unquote people, or are you loyal to the state? And what you see in areas near borders are areas where there are transnational peoples, or people who may be peripatetic, people who may be quote unquote nomadic, is that they tend to be very heavily policed. They tend to be very heavily scrutinized. And they tend to need to continuously perform their relationship and their loyalty to the state. Specifically, I've worked for over 20 years with Romani people, pejoratively called gypsies. I speak Romani, I'm not Roma. But I've also done work with Sami people, the indigenous people of northern Norway, Finland, Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia. And I'll speak specifically in terms of both of those folks, and again, how they represent themselves in their own media and in their own advocacy. But one of the questions that we were kind of brought to in order to digest was our own understanding of borders and what borders means to us. And I have to say, I have a very uncomfortable relationship with borders. I have a very uncomfortable relationship with borders, with flags, because I have a very uncomfortable relationship with nationalism. Very often, what ends up happening when you have a border is that you're not talking about necessarily who's in. In order to talk about who's in, you have to talk about who's out. And then people often will find that they need to self-police in order to be included in the conversation, whether we're talking about the conversation of Canada, whether we're talking the conversation in terms of queerdom, whether we're talking about a conversation in terms of genders, whether we're talking about a conversation in terms of religion or nation. There becomes this self-policing that can become very dangerous. And then a policing within your own borders about whether you actually belong, whether others actually belong. I have a problem with that. I have a problem because when we're talking about them, whoever they are, what we're really often talking about is a fear and an uncomfortability of who we are in that sense. If we can go to the next slide, please. And this is where we come into the conversation in terms of media and the perspective of who is telling stories and how the world is actually seen, and how it's seen very differently when the state itself is not the framer of the conversation. This map was actually taken, it's a photo that was found in the Sami Museum in Inari on the Finnish side of Sapmi. And this is the view of the world if you're looking at it from up north. It's a very different view. It's a very different perspective of how we understand the stories, how we understand literally the world around us. What is our standing point? What is our vantage point? Where are we coming from? And this was actually in a museum that was created by Sami in order to tell the stories of Sami, both to Sami people as well as to non-Sami people. And I like this because it helps us figure out where we can start from. But then when we're talking, and when I'm talking about media and how, again, how people represent themselves, transnational peoples represent themselves in their own media, I really want us to understand that I'm talking about media as a tool, as well as a product in terms of nationalism. So for instance, we're looking at this map, and if we want to say, what is the weather of where the Inuit live, for instance, where are we going to start? Are we going to be starting in Greenland? Are we going to be starting in Russia? Are we going to be starting in Alaska? Are we going to be starting in Canada? If we're going to be looking at this map and we're going to say, you know, what is the weather, going back, for instance, to Dr. Fontaine's map of where Anishinaabe people live, where are we going to start there? But if we look at media, it's almost always coming from that of the state. So what does that mean in order to reframe? Next slide. Here, I'm also, for instance, looking, you know, I've done a lot of work regarding the Roma population, which is spread not only in Europe, although that tends to be where people to focus on, but actually also within North Africa and the Middle East, as well as over 1 million Roma people here in Canada. And you'll see here that the latest numbers I can find are actually from 2008. Because so often what ends up happening is that transnational peoples have their stories told about them, have their research told about them. They don't actually have a chance to be able to say their own stories or do their own research. And yet this has very strict policy implications and very concrete policy implications, as was spoken of by Dr. Wilkinson and will be spoken of by my subsequent presenters. Can we go to the next slide, please? But I want to be very clear that this is changing, and this has always changed. Transnational peoples who are one nation that are crossing over between and within many states are not passive. They're actually often consistently involved in a purposeful process of denaturalizing, denormalizing, and decolonizing the rhetoric, the stories told about them, as a means of redefining, rewriting, and reclaiming the stories that are told by them. And this is a strategic form of intervention within the media, and therefore also within policy and within politics. At times, this may seem incoherent. This may seem inconsistent. Why are Roma people saying one thing, for instance, in their own media, and saying a different thing in European media, or saying a different thing at the UN, or a different thing in the state media? But it's actually done very strategically, because it's done as with particular goals in mind. And this form of intervention, this form of reclaiming a story, is also a form of agency that I think often gets lost when we're seeing people who may not fit well within a traditional notion of the nation state as simply victims, rather than as active agents. And I want to stop at this point. We can stop the slides here. Because although refugees are not transnational peoples, and although there are indigenous peoples who are not necessarily transnational peoples, these are all people who have a complicated, difficult relationship with the nation state. And they are all people who are using media and using advocacy as a form of claim making, and that must be respected and that must be listened to. And I want to invite us all to really move past tropes of how we may see people and rather listen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Plaut. We will pass things over to Rob Lorway.
Thank you. I'm just going to wait till the slide comes up. That's great. So firstly, I want to thank Professor Adele Perry for generously inviting me to join this dynamic group of thinkers to consider borders in relation to my ethnographic work. I think in many ways it picks up on what Dr. Fontaine is talking about in relationship to cooperation across borders, that particular theme, as well as Dr. Plaut's notion of borders and producing forms of alterity or difference or otherness. So I decided, if you can switch to the next slide, please. So I decided to begin with this image because it helps to articulate ways of thinking about borders that relate to territory and the sovereign state system. So this image holds together two, and why I find it interesting, two opposing notions of borders. So the first being about borders as sites of exchange, diplomacy, and humanitarian aid, as reflected in Jill Biden's recent visit to Kenya earlier in early this year in February. And the second way this image evokes borders is in the sense of protectionism, security, and various definitions of threat, both internally and externally with respect to the nation state. So above the photo of Jill Biden, opposition MP Peter Kaluma posts an anti-queer message, and it says, LGBTQ must fall. So elsewhere in his Twitter feed, Kaluma goes on to draw a linkage between US foreign aid disbursement and the growth of LGBTQ presence in Kenya. And this follows on a recent Supreme Court decision to approve, and this is only about a month ago, to approve the official registration of LGBTQ organizations. So much of, and if you look throughout the African continent, across different African country contexts, you notice that a lot of this post-colonial anti-queer state rhetoric defines homosexuality as an imported European cultural practice and form of colonial residue. So borders is not just about something that's geospatial, but it's also something that's about temporality and history. So much of my research focuses on how transnational consortia of HIV epidemic responders, which includes Kenyan and Canadian scientists, including those at the University of Manitoba, global policymakers and global activists, kind of work around and to circumvent state authority to deliver health services within a homophobic climate. So these more conventional notions of borders and territories and states that we're more familiar with still form a crucial backdrop in the story that my findings tell. Go to the next slide, please. Historically, epidemiology, HIV epidemiology, has drawn larger transnational boundaries around types of epidemics. So between Africa's supposedly distinctive heterosexual epidemic and the gay HIV epidemic in the West. And this is a point that media studies scholar Cindy Patton has made, quite a number of years ago in the 1980s. So the distinction abets a number of very racist stereotypes of African sexualities as being tied to nature, reproductively oriented, and lacking in terms of sexual diversity. However, LGBTQ rights movements led by African people themselves, which exploded in around the 1990s, around the mid-1990s, disrupted these images or these imagined boundaries between Western sexual difference and African hyper-heterosexuality. So by 2007, epidemiology and public health began to recognize not only that same-sex transmission of HIV took place in African countries, but African gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men actually shoulder a considerably higher burden of HIV infections compared to other groups. As a consequence, epidemiologists and global policymakers erected a new set of borders between the so-called general population and those classified as being the most at risk, those who came to be known as key populations. And these key populations include men who have sex with men, female sex workers, and people who inject substances. So key populations as a construct in HIV science follows a particular security logic. Firstly, it conceptually cordons off groups assumed to pose a threat to the health of Kenyan citizens. In this way, logics overlap with and reiterate the boundaries between legitimacy, who is legitimate Kenyan, and who's criminalized, delegitimated, in other words. Furthermore, these new borders furnish the grounds for a constellation of tracking techniques to flourish. And so here we're talking about quite a range of different technologies and tracking technologies, of which I don't have time to go into, but they're related to following patterns in health service utilization, looking at changes in sexual practices over time, and looking at and studying discrete locations of transmission known as hotspots, a term that we've heard a lot during COVID, certainly. Next slide, please. Now, for the health activists that I've worked alongside since about 2009, I've noticed how these meeting spaces, where they organize their health advocacy work and community outreach work, how they've become deluged with the material traces of an emergent surveillance culture. So this includes geospatial mapping data that's posted on their walls, multiple bar diagrams charting program adherence of their members, micro-planning tools to measure the flows of clients at hotspots where gay and bisexual men congregate to find sexual partners. And there's also long lists of outreach workers, sort of outreach contacts that are often posted on the walls as well. So I've written about elsewhere how these artifacts of disease surveillance act as what Susan Lee Starr refers to as boundary objects. And boundary objects, what they are is they're sort of plastic objects that migrate across diverse spheres, in this case, of health intervention. So they've migrated. And so I'm talking less about the migration of people, but more about the migration of technologies here. So they've traveled from the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, to Kenyan and Canadian universities, to the Kenya Ministry of Health, to community activist meeting spaces. And their continual migration between these diverse worlds blurs, almost collapses boundaries between global disease surveillance, national policymaking, and community health advocacy. Importantly here, this continual border crossing of surveillance techniques and technologies have profoundly transformed the nature of community politics itself, such that queer, sex worker, and HIV activism in Kenya has become highly inflected with technical discourses. Next slide, please. So there are, however, some surveillance objects that are less flexible in their ability to migrate across boundaries. Community health activists stubbornly refuse to accept the employment of biometrics for program management. In this way, I think of biometrics, and specifically electronic fingerprinting, as a kind of border object, to use Hannah Mashry's term, because it upholds as it demarcates the boundaries between community health interests, status, biosecurity agendas, and transnational HIV scientific concerns for disease tracking. Next slide, please. So Kenyan queer, sex worker, and HIV activists have united to resist the use of biometrics to deliver health services in their communities. This has happened over the past decade. And they have forcefully and effectively expressed their dissenting views in regular meetings with health officials. And they've condemned HIV scientists in global forums like the International AIDS Conference and during UN AIDS policy meetings held in Geneva and the US. The Global Network of Sex Workers, which is this transnational consortium, in fact, commissioned their own study to interrogate new surveillance techniques. Here's an excerpt of what they had to say about biometrics, and I'll read it along with you. The current and potential use of biometrics measures, such as fingerprints, retinal scans, and other unique physical identifiers, are extremely worrisome and constitute human rights violations. Their use is fraught with potential violations of privacy and increases the risk of tracking and profiling sex workers in contexts where they are often criminalized. Additionally, they require a high level of technology which might not be sustainable for smaller organizations, and that could lead to more errors or breaches of confidentiality. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So although sharpening divisions between communities and scientists and policymakers, the biometrics controversy has also assembled previously divided risk groups into a single key population consortium that launched a virtual protest in 2017 that went viral across transnational sex worker, HIV queer rights activist networks. But what is also important to note here is that while there is a clear refusal to accept the use of biometrics, there is also, ironically perhaps, a clear demand for the IBBS. So the IBBS, as you'll note in this particular image, is a very intensive biological and behavioral surveillance procedure. So in this way, sex worker politics are revealed as being entangled with surveillance culture, as the IBBS itself and their demand, as they put it, becomes reframed within the language of rights. Next slide, please. So to conclude, what I've been noticing in my ethnographic research is the emergence of what I refer to as evidentiary politics. And I define this as a transnational field, a political contestation surrounding the precision-oriented forms of tracking, measuring, and managing life used in the name of HIV prevention and care. And so activists' growing literacy with surveillance science enables them to precisely pinpoint and defy the undemocratic imperatives of an encroaching transnational experimental order that aims to govern the health of key populations. So the targeted approach to surveilling key populations may be considered as further marginalizing stigmatized groups. I think that's very obvious, and certainly endangering them, which is something I'm happy to talk about if there's time for questions. But it's important to note how the key population epidemiological construct also enables activists to forge international alliances to mobilize transnational resources to keep the Kenyan government in check. And they did this starting in 2013 until only a few years ago, just before COVID, when the government of Kenya capitulated to the demands by removing biometric protocols from the IBBS. So these transnational resources that queer, sex worker, and HIV activists have cultivated are incredibly crucial at this particular moment when the state is attempting to draft highly punitive anti-homosexual legislation that mirrors Uganda's new laws. And these new laws, of course, you probably heard in the international news media, has just been passed within the past week and has been signed into law by the president. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
I was on mute there. Thank you very much, Dr. Lorway. So I will now pass things to Dr. Shauna Labman.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a little challenging to go last because there's so much different ideas and thoughts that have circulated. It's also challenging because I'm still particularly chilled to the bone because I spent my morning in Emerson along the border with the US doing advocacy on the Safe Third Country Agreement with Member of Parliament Jenny Kwan, who's the immigration critic, and Leah Gazan, who is the MP for Winnipeg Centre, as well as Seydou Mohamed, who is now a Canadian citizen. But in order to get to Canada to make his refugee claim in 2016, he crossed at that border in December in the midst of a snowstorm up to his waist, suffered immense frostbite, lost some limbs, and yet still made it to Canada, was able to make his refugee claim, was recognized to be a refugee, and is now a Canadian citizen. And the reason we were on the border this morning, as Adele referenced at the beginning of the talk, is because the Canadian government has just, and I put just in quotation marks because they actually did it a year ago and kept it secret for a year, but has just announced that the Safe Third Country Agreement, which used to apply only at official ports of entry, and did enable refugees like Seydou Mohamed to avoid the official port of entry, cross into Canada, still relatively dangerously, but actually get here and make their claim. And because particularly at Roxham Road in Quebec, that had become a somewhat orderly process where people knew instead of traipsing through winter fields or crossing through dangerous and cold waters, they could cross at Roxham Road and make that claim. And according to the Immigration and Refugee Protection regulations, do what is set out directly in there to present themselves without delay and make that claim. At Roxham Road now, there is a sign telling refugee claimants that it is illegal to cross into Canada to make their refugee claim. This is simply not true on a number of fronts. It's not true because the Safe Third Country Agreement itself has exceptions that enable people to present and make a refugee claim, but it's also not true that it is illegal to make a refugee claim. Refugees have a right to claim protection. Canada has committed and signed the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. Not only did Canada agree to that, they helped draft it. And as Dr. Wilkinson mentioned in her presentation, part of the reason we didn't think too much possibly when we were drafting that or signing it is because we're far away from most refugee flows. We have what a geographer, Jennifer Heinemann, has called cold ocean geography, which means we're mostly surrounded by cold oceans, and our only land border, the only place where refugee claimants can possibly cross into Canada and claim protection is our border with the US, which is a 9,000 kilometer long border. And I stood outside at the edge of Emerson in a windy, cold farmland, and it was only, I think, -6. But I felt like I was going to throw up after standing out there for 30 minutes because it was horrifically cold and windy. And now what the government has proposed, well, not even proposed, what they put into force is that the entirety of that border triggers the Safe Third Country Agreement, making people ineligible, subject to a few minor exceptions, to make a refugee claim in Canada if they arrive in the United States first. Now, first and foremost, it's much easier to get to the United States than to get to Canada, simply because there are more places to arrive. There are more airports, more airplanes, more crossing places, as well as a land route and that border to the south. So this is really an isolating move of Canada's to try and seal off access to refugee protection in Canada. And this ties into my work, which, as Adele mentioned at the beginning, focuses on refugee resettlement, because what I actually do in my work is talk about that relationship between asylum and resettlement, that relationship between who we have a legal obligation to admit and give protection to, and where we have discretionary welcome. Our legal obligation sits with asylum seekers, those who come into Canada and claim refugee protection, because that is what we have signed into in the 1951 Refugee Convention. Beyond that, and because the truth is not that many people actually come that way, nor have they ever actually come that way, we do refugee resettlement. Now, I would also say that we do most of our resettlement these days through private sponsorship, putting that choice of welcome and that discretion of welcome on individual Canadian citizens instead of the government. And there's been a real sort of numeric shift between government resettlement and private sponsorship. But along that, what we are seeing increasingly is this humanitarian veil of saying we are a humanitarian nation because we accept refugees through resettlement. We are a humanitarian nation because we bring people in from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from Syria. And what we are doing at the border is something different because these people are doing something illegal, which is, again, a use of language and not what is taking place. The Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada I feel like they're simply trying to make me scream right now, but they're running a campaign on their social media and on their website that is saying, give a warm Canadian welcome. And there's a survey on Twitter that you cannot put your own answer into. You have to make one of their choices. But they're talking about how we give a warm Canadian welcome to individuals. And indeed, the government has committed to their commitment of 40,000 Afghan refugees coming in by way of resettlement. We have approved over 600,000 visas for Ukrainian nationals to come into this country. But somehow under 40,000 people trying to cross and claim protection at our borders is something that we as a country have decided we need to protect ourselves from by sealing that border. And thinking, I was a little worried that Rob would be a little more challenging to connect with in this talk, but when he started talking about privacy and securitization and monitoring, what is the absurdity of this promise at the border to seal off our border from refugee claimants is that it is a 9,000 kilometer long border. We cannot seal it off from crossings. There is no way that we will see the security of that entire border. And if we saw that, if we actually had a way to monitor the entirety of that border from people crossing, I don't know what that would cost, but it would be absurd. And I would much rather put that money towards settlement. And B, it is not a country I would want to live in. It is a very different sense of Canada. And so the reality is we're not doing that. No matter what money they put into it, what control of the border, it gets amplified now. What's actually going to happen is that people will take riskier routes into this country. They will take dangerous routes, isolated routes, abandoned routes. They will put their lives into the hands of human smugglers who will increase their ability and knowledge of ways to defy our security systems. And then, because this new expansion has a 14-day hide and seek provision in it, people like Seydou Mohammed, who when he crossed the border needed to immediately try and flag someone down to take him to safety and get medical attention, would then have to make the choice to hide for 14 days. And how they hide for 14 days, how they even prove that they've hidden for 14 days when they eventually make their claim, is hard for me to conceive at this point. But instead of having people come across our border and present without a delay to make a refugee claim, we are forcing people to take dangerous routes. We are forcing people to hide, and that puts our own security at more threat than anything these people were doing when they are coming and presenting for protection. So I have some struggles there. I wanted to, what else did I want to say here? I went on a bit of a rant, apologies. The global number of people forced to flee worldwide has now reached over 100 million for the first time in record. 100 million. That's 1 in every 78 people on the planet. And as all the presenters here have said, people have lots of different reasons and needs to move. These borders are superficial. They don't necessarily represent our identities and our locations. And what we're doing with these border policies to carve ourselves out as a nation state, as this Canada that is protected from outsiders, is far from giving a warm welcome to anyone. So I'll stop there.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Labman for standing out at the border in the wind this morning with members of Parliament, Leah Gazan and Jenny Kwan and Seydou Mohammed and others. And I want to thank all of our speakers for engaging these questions of borders in ways that were incredibly different, but also profoundly connected, and all speak to some of the really kind of complicated and pressing work that borders and resisting to borders involves. So we've received some questions via registration and via the chat, and one that came in early that is, I think, behind a lot of what people already said, but just to draw it out, is how to speak truth to power. And I guess that is a question that perhaps we can all address, and also just open it up for the panelists if they have questions for one another. So I'll just open that up, but then suggest that we come back to this question of how to best speak these various truths to the sorts of power that we have seen and always see on display, but are certainly seeing in very kind of lucid terms in these past couple of weeks. And I will suggest that people just unmute themselves and ask your question.
I can address the truth to power question, if that's okay. I think there are many ways that we can activate people. And I think how you activate is going to depend on where you are, what you know, and who you're speaking with. So, trying to first educate people about refugee needs, on an international scale, but also on a Canadian scale. And by educating them, understanding that the average person probably actually does care about the needs of refugees. And so I always try to approach it positively. Sometimes you'll find out that you're talking to somebody who is maybe less interested in helping refugees, but I still kind of use the same tactic, right? Like trying to make sure that factual information is presented, whether or not the person believes you is a different thing. And I think at an individual level, we change the minds of people one by one. And so the more people that we can arm with the information that they need to tackle myths is a good starting point. But if you want to be active, there's other things that you can do if you have time, right? Like supporting refugee organizations, even signing a petition, right? As soon as petitions get thousands of people's names on them, politicians start to listen, right? And so when they come knocking on your door, they call you, you ask them, like, what do you think about refugees? Because, if you don't give me the right answer, you ain't getting my vote. And I know that they don't always have to follow, they can lie. But I think if we hold our politicians' feet to the fire, so to speak, they can no longer get away with platitudes. And I just wanted to mention that CTV is running a new story right now, and that Trudeau has basically said, we need an orderly migration system. We need to educate our politicians that the problem isn't an orderly migration system. The problem exists in our world. Ideally, nobody wants to be a refugee. Ideally, everybody wants to live in peace and harmony and to be able to live safely where they are. And I think until we get politicians to stop about getting reelected and thinking about the wider world problem, all of this other stuff we're doing politically, it's just putting a Band-Aid on. It's not going to help the problem at all. So I'll let somebody more knowledgeable than me blather on about what they think about this.
I mean, I can jump in here in terms of speaking truth to power, because I think that's what I personally like to focus on. I like to focus on what are people doing in terms of saying their own stories and saying their own stories and their own truths in order to get what they want to get done. And I mean, if we're going to be talking about an orderly migration into our country, I think that we need to really look at some of the First Nations, the First Peoples here and say, hey, how is that orderly migration into this country, right? Didn't end very well for anybody. And it's continuing to go on because it has not ended, because colonialism continues. And so one of the things that I think needs to happen, and I think that can happen, is really denormalizing borders. Borders are created for political, economic reasons, and borders are creating this us and this them by those who are creating and policing those borders. So when we listen to what Dr. Labman is speaking of in terms of this, increasing fear, or also what Dr. Lorway is speaking of in terms of this increasing fear, of them, this imposed homosexuality that somehow always comes from over there, or this imposed, these people who creep in. We need to flip it around and say, what are we scared of? And who is the we that is scared here? What is that? What are we afraid? Not to go back to Edward Said and Orientalism and all of that, but really it comes down to what is the fear? And if we can own that fear, and if that fear can be exposed in a public way, then we can look for solutions and strategies. But otherwise, we're always going to look towards them, and that becomes the story. We need to reclaim that story, and we need to reclaim that story by listening to people's ways of saying their own stories.
I can jump in because I think that's true, Shayna. But I also, when I'm scanning the list of participants and panelists here, when I think about the power and the lawmakers and those who take these actions, the Safe Third Country Agreement, as an example, was agreed upon in 2002 and came into force in 2004. And so for the last 20 years, refugee advocates have been saying this agreement should be suspended. And when certain political parties in the past said, no, it should be expanded, even the current political governing party said, no, that's an absurdity. And now, despite all that, despite a constitutional challenge at the Supreme Court of Canada that is still pending, the government, the politics play harder. And those are very sort of short-sighted politics and a politics under threat, I think. But I'm feeling it a challenging moment, if I'm honest, of speaking truth to power, because I feel like I've been screaming for 20 years. And I know I said this morning, but for the last year, it really literally has been falling on deaf ears because the agreement had already been agreed upon. It just had not been released to the public. So hearing voices and creating space, absolutely. But I think in the world we're living in, when you talk about the nation state, when we see these sort of changing realities in the world we live in, I'm feeling nervous, I guess is what I'd say. And that's not that's not my usual space, but these last 2 weeks have been kind of gutting.
Can I just directly respond to Dr. Labman's point on that one? Is that okay, Shauna?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really look at what takes place in Europe, in England specifically, with an organization called Migrant Voice that basically, you know, said, all right, we need to engage in some kind of strategic essentialism here. We need to get folks together who are migrants, whether they're refugees, refugee claimants, students, traveling artists, you know, whatever. Like, you can really use this term migrant, which especially in Europe is very filled with fear and migrants, you know. And they actually made a newspaper called Migrant Voice and then a website called Migrant Voice to be able to speak back, because there was an understanding that when it's in multiple different voices, divided we fall, right? And it hasn't worked. I mean, Brexit and Rwanda, right? We could see that right now. But it also is creating fertile ground for continued advocacy. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's a long game.
Well, and I think that's the hard part right now, right? It's feeling like a very long game. That we feel like, I think with the UK policies on Rwanda, with the STCA, with all of this, we're feeling a real pushback. And so that's all I was trying to point out, that the sort of the truth to power, the power is pretty strong right now.
Yeah, I think that gives us a lot to sort of sit with. Dr. Fontaine, I was wondering if this was something you might want to speak to, both in terms of the sort of speaking truth to power question, and also just where we are sitting right now and what those possibilities and limits also are.
Well, I was actually just reflecting on a woman from Akwesasne, her response when, you know, in light of what's happened there. And she said that she was, you know, she was chill, like as Dr. Labman said, she was chilled to the bone. She couldn't even speak because she was so upset that this happened on their territory, and particularly that there were children, that really put her in such an emotional state that she couldn't speak. And I think that a lot of Indigenous people have experienced border challenges for very different reasons, right? Just crossing traditional boundaries. They're not life-threatening situations, but they're often, you know, cultural barriers, being harassed by border patrols. I know a number of situations when I was down in the US where there's actually a border right on the reservation where they can't even access their water resources. And I think bringing Indigenous leaders and Indigenous peoples into the conversation around borders, particularly that straddle their territory, might change the conversation about land rights and mobility rights. And I think that a lot of Indigenous people haven't really turned their mind to these issues. And I think, you know, certainly people at Akwesasne are starting to think about border issues. I think I'm also thinking about a class that Dr. Labman and I taught last year, I think it was, where we had, it was on refugee and Aboriginal rights. And some of the things that the students brought up about border issues were about identity and belonging. You know, what does home mean to you? And there was a lot of resonance around those topics that overlapped, that brought conversations into stories about people's relationships about crossing borders and how that impacts identity and belonging. So I think bringing young people into these conversations too might also broaden the conversations beyond what politicians say about borders, and might invigorate some activism work that bring younger voices into the picture, which I think are really important too. So I think education, activism are really critical right now, and perhaps bringing in some different voices around discussions on borders.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Rob, did you something you'd like to weigh in on?
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of speak to the themes. I know it's very different, the kind of research I'm doing, but I guess in thinking about what's happening in Kenya, and some of the contexts where we work, and it's sort of in this post-COVID moment where there is this kind of economic unraveling, and the way that that's stirring these kinds of really intense moralizing politics, kind of othering that and Dr. Plaut was talking about. I guess I'm sort of similarly feeling a bit of, somewhat nihilistic, as Dr. Labman's sort of suggesting too, because it seems like this unraveling is not coming to an end anytime soon. And we're also in a moment where we're seeing, thinking about borders and cross borders exchanges of different kinds, because they're not always necessarily positive, where how sort of the status rhetoric in Kenya is actually now borrowing language from Uganda, and the way they've recriminalized homosexuality in really punitive terms, right? And talking about death penalties, life imprisonment, this kind of thing, how they're borrowing from that legislation to construct their own, but also how they're working with sort of transphobic discourses emanating out of sort of US right-leaning politics as well, is sort of solidifying that. In terms of speaking truth to power, I'm thinking about the activists I work with. They're incredibly savvy, although many of them are exploring sort of how to claim refugee status in a number of countries outside of Kenya. So I think the story that I'll be telling in a year will be probably much closer to a lot of what other panelists are sharing. But my only sort of, to end on a hopeful note, so I don't sound entirely nihilistic, is that they have become incredibly skilled at doing these kinds of transnational mobilizations. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of unfolds there. It's not something I can do. I can provide sort of maybe forums to amplify and share what kinds of things they're doing, but really the work of decolonizing anti-gay rhetoric is really coming from them and led by them. So I guess that part of the story is yet to unfold. Thanks.
Yeah. Absolutely. We began this speaker series with a really fascinating conversation between Alex Wilson and Harsha Walia that very much drew kind of connections between kind of Indigenous resistance and sovereignty and kind of anti-borders, no one is illegal kind of connections. And I feel like we're kind of coming back to some of those kind of foundational ways that conversation began. And I know as a nerdy historian, one thing that I'm really struck with right now is how bleak the 1920s, the years that followed the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920, and 21, it went on for a long time, were both for Indigenous peoples in Canada, insofar as the escalation of the Indian Act to do things like restrict rights to hire a lawyer, to make that illegal, the kind of the consolidation of residential schooling, which reached its kind of numeric reached its greatest size in those years, and connected with enormously kind of violent anti-migrant kind of rhetoric, which kind of culminated in the banning of Chinese migration in 1923. And those years tend to get kind of lost when we kind of register World War I and World War II, sometimes the Depression, but the difficulties of the 20s as a post-pandemic moment, which really kind of saw an uptick in those connected, I think, forms of kind of coercion against Indigenous people and against migrants seem to be real enough to me right now. There's a number of really important questions that have come in via the chat, which you will be able to sort of see here. I'm also mindful that over 80 people have joined us for over an hour today on a day where many things are happening. And I guess I will just ask the panel if there's any kind of final brief comments that you might like to make before we draw the event to a close.
I'll just start because I don't want to be speaking only in the negative. This country is full of incredible advocates and supporters, and the model of sponsorship and resettlement we have in this country means that Canadians know refugees, and they are part of our communities. They're our friends, they're our students, they're our neighbors. And so we are in a bad moment. I feel it's just a hard moment right now for a lot in the refugee advocacy community. But I think we have the strength and potential to move past it. So I don't want to bring everyone down. So I'll leave it there.
I'd just like to say that's the spirit of my comments. There's so much that we can do together, and we have a long fight ahead of us. But if we keep fighting, eventually something's going to change. Many government people have told me that they need to hear the same thing from 10 different people before they get this aha moment. I know. And I think for those of us who have those connections and who work in the area, we can mobilize. And maybe we sound like a broken record, but we sound like a broken record. And if we put this in the minds of our government officials that Canadians think this is important, they might actually do something about it.
I think, and this is my broken record. It's not always just fighting, but it's also presenting alternatives. It's sometimes can be really easy to just say what we're against, and sometimes it can be really powerful to say, well, what are we for? Of course, now I'm going back to the we situation, which is always problematic, but I think also just showing other possibilities, as well as warning labels of what has happened in other places, but other possibilities, and saying this is what we are for, and giving the space for people to do that for themselves too. Like Sidhu Muhammad being there and speaking his truth in that sense.
So I'll just ask, I don't know if Dr. Fontaine or Lorway would like to have a final comment before we end the session.
I'm actually, usually I have some like concluding thoughts, but right now I have a lot of questions and different ideas floating through, which says to me that there needs to be more conversations around borders
Mhm.
in a number of different, not only because they, well, they deserve more discussions from different areas, but because I think that I can see openings for people from different communities to come together and learn from each other's stories. So one of the threads that I've heard in a number of the comments and the presentations were about hearing our stories. So perhaps there's some food for thought in that. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed listening to everybody.
Thank you very much.
I really don't have anything to add except also a thank you.
No, that's all
And I also
great.
don't want to be the last one to speak,
I know.
considering mine was so far left afield.
No, but it wasn't.
In certain senses. Yeah, I'm like Dr. Fontaine, I'm also sort of I'm not left with a solid feeling of a path in terms of some of the advocacy work that I do. But it's sort of kind of waiting to see how the story unfolds, because there is the refugee claiming process that will follow, that speaks to the kinds of concerns that people are speaking about, given that there are such virulent kinds of policies that are happening, not just in Uganda, but in Kenya. It's like a house of cards. It's falling.
Yeah.
So that's where I want to leave it. But thank you for inviting me to think
Oh.
about these ideas with everyone. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody for joining us and thinking out loud around these questions. I think in really important and in new ways. I want to thank Dr. Lorena Fontaine, Dr. Lori Wilkinson, Dr. Rob Lorway, Dr. Shayna Plaut, Dr. Shauna Labman. I also want to thank Dr. Pauline Tennant, who has done so much to make this event happen, and without whom things really would not have happened. So so grateful for her work here and always. I want to thank the 80-odd people who joined us. I also want to note that we've got one event coming up on Wednesday. It's also a webinar, and we are doing this in collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and it has to do with discrimination in the private housing market. It is a lunchtime webinar, and you can look at chrr.info and register and join us to talk about housing in a couple of days. And again, I want to thank everybody who made some time to speak some important truths to power and leave us with questions going forward. Thank you very much.